Giacomo is the first of the three project research speakers today of our institute. Giacomo, can you introduce yourself very briefly?
Oh, okay. I don't know if I'll tell you, but yeah, it's the same. Well, I just switched my project research because previously during my PhD I was working on women contemporary philosophers and especially Nishida and Hersch. Now I'm switching. I'm trying to learn something about Eastern perspective, especially Japanese perspective. So also today the topic is an in-between what I did before and what I am trying to do now, as you can see from the title. But yeah, before starting, I want to thank Alessandro, Professor Pongaro, for organizing this speech, this occasion for dialoguing and debating on this interesting topic. And in my speech, I would like to start from some really famous lines that have stimulated many philosophical debates and that falls under the name of third antinomy. I think everyone knows them. And these lines are from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And Kant writes, causality in accordance with laws of nature is not the only one from which all the appearances of can be derived. It is also necessary to assume another causality through freedom in order to explain them. And just the page after, Kant writes, there is no freedom, but everything in the world happens solely in accordance with laws of nature. So here, the problem for the intellect is how can natural causality and freedom coexist? But before trying to formulate an answer to this problem, let's have a look at the plan of my speech. So in this speech, Kant's third antinomy is merely a pretext to reflect on the limits and the peculiarity of philosophy, and particularly the implication of such reflection for philosophical expression, which should be today's topic. More precisely, the starting point is the attempt to resolve Kant's third antinomy by arguing that there are not two separate worlds, that of natural causality and that of freedom, but rather two ways of approaching the same one world. And these ways, of course, are different, but yet mutually necessary. So my aim is to show how two very different thinkers, Nishida and Hersch, draw a similar conclusion while maintaining a certain distance, having a significant point of contact in their common reference to Henri Bergson. And here I will not discuss the goodness of the interpretations proposed, but I will try to leave as much space as possible to this author's words. Also, since we are talking about expression and images, all the arguments will revolve around the quotation of these effective images developed by these two authors. So we can start with part one about Nishida on Bergson. And regarding Nishida's association with Bergson, Nishida already knows Bergson when he publishes an Inquiry into the Good in 1911. And he admits that Bergson thought played an indispensable role to formulate the idea of pure experience, which he presents in this book. Here, of course, Bergson is not the first focus, and he does not appear explicitly. But there are still some good images for contextualizing some relevant concepts in Nishida. So before starting with an Inquiry into the Good, I would like to read these lines from Nishida's diary, because to me they clearly explain Nishida's point of view at that time. Nishida writes, ethics in the West is purely an intellectual pursuit. Its arguments are cogent, but no one pays attention to the soul experience. People forget the ground on which they stand. There are those who analyze the constituents of bread and water, but none considers the actual taste of either. And finally, we can start with Inquiry into the Good. The image that Nishida uses in this slide, he writes it after having stated that the subject and the object cannot exist independently of each other, and mind and matter are not two different realities, but rather, he writes, two different ways of looking at a single fact. And the image he writes says, as a concrete fact, flower is not at all like the purely material flower of scientists. It is pleasing, with a beauty of color, shape, and scent. Heine gazed at the stars in a quiet night sky and called them golden texts in the azure. Though astronomers would laugh at his words as the folly of a poet, the true nature of stars may very well be expressed in his phrase. So what Nishida wants to communicate here is that dispassionate knowledge comes second when the subject puts a distance from their object, and at the beginning, knowledge, feeling, and volition are one, and the true reality we experience at first is something with meaning, says Nishida. And in this regard, he calls pure experience such initial meaningful union. And the second point is that Nishida affirms that to him, truth is, we can read in the slide, what comes closest to the most concrete facts of experience, lies in unity, and pertains to the individual person, and is actual. And immediately after he writes, perfect truth cannot be expressed in words, and scientific truth cannot be considered perfect truths. So yeah, these are quite relevant statements, I would say. But going on with the second passage, here we can clarify some points. And Nishida writes, for example, I have a pen here. In the instant of seeing it, there is neither knowledge nor volition. There is just a single actuality. When various associations concerning it arise, the center of consciousness shifts, and when the original consciousness is objectified, it comes to be merely intellectual. In contrast, let us imagine that the associated idea arises that this pen is for writing letters. While this associated idea is still attached to the original consciousness as a fringe element, it is knowledge. But when the associated consciousness begins to stand on its own, it becomes a state of desire. Accordingly, when associated consciousness has become an increasingly independent actuality, it is the will, and in addition, one truly knows it. So the world is always the same, and what changes is the consciousness that approaches the world. The very first moment in the individual reality is the instant of seeing, says Nishida, in which the single actuality is not affected by knowledge or volition. Only then, the original consciousness is objectified, and the intellectual associations can lead to knowledge or desire. And here Nishida clearly states that this is a matter of degree, so a quantitative rather than a qualitative difference. Because all these different moments are grounded in the very first moment of pure experience. And even if Nishida does not mention Kant here directly, he shows that it is perfectly possible to him that everything in the world follows the law of nature and another causality through freedom. And what we must highlight here is that these two forms of causality are complementary. And we can go on with the third passage, and Nishida writes, let us take, for example, a bronze statue. The bronze, the statue's raw material, obeys physical and chemical laws. Yet, we cannot view the statue as a mere lump of bronze, for it is a work of art that expresses our ideals. It appeared by means of the unifying power of our ideals. The unifying activity of the ideals and the physical and chemical laws that control the raw material belong to different spheres, and in no way do they clash with each other. So the bronze statue is raw material, of course, but it is also a work of art. And there is an original encounter, and this encounter constitutes the ideal that inspires the artist. And this recalls the concept of truth as something actual, Nishida says, as an event. So the final definition, which I think could be retraced in these first passages, is that pure experience is the event of an encounter. And this is our most truthful experience. And Nishida says that it is something that the artist can express better than the scholar. So this is the general context of Nishida's reflection. And before going on to the second book from Nishida, here are some lines from Dalissier, who to me describes quite well the attitude which is common to Bergson and Nishida. And in particular here, he distinguishes between the cold combination of intelligence and the fire of the primitive coincidence. And yeah, this is a quite effective image. And the most interesting thing is that it will come nearly in identical way in Hersch. But now, yeah, let's move to thoughts and experiences. So the second book from Nishida. And here, Nishida, as you can see, devotes 3 short articles to Bergson. And in these pages, the central concept in Nishida's reflection is intuition. So this first image from this book gives us an idea of the meaning of intuition to Nishida. And Nishida writes, even that truth extracted from the depths of intuition, both in the sciences and in philosophy, once exposed to the light of the intellect, has dried up and hardened. The intuition I have spoken of in this essay has nothing mysterious about it, and there is no one who more or less does not experience it. For example, anyone who has experience of writing knows that once one has decided on a title, something is still missing, namely, the effort to see it becoming the thing itself. Once this state is achieved, the spirit is spontaneously activated and words flow copiously from the brush. Philosophical intuition is also something of this kind, only the material is all the observations and experiences accumulated by the sciences. So intuition to Nishida appears to be the name of the aforementioned encounter between an individuality and the world. And it is a way of seeing from the inside and becoming the thing itself. Nishida repeats it many times, forgetting about our point of view and our associations. And philosophy should be aware of such dynamics and give back importance to intuition, since Nishida says intuition is philosophy's lead for touching and expressing reality. And here Nishida keeps also specifying that we should clearly understand the role of sciences and philosophy and not confuse them. And quoting Bergson, he states that intellect has a practical function and it sets concepts to achieve certain purposes, but when we want to know the truth, we should follow the way of intention. And in this sense, he says that philosophy is the science of intention, or yeah, at least it should be so. But gradually moving on to the reflection on the method of expression, Nishida recalls that in Bergson, we can retrace 2 different approaches. So the analytical method sees things from the outside and expresses them through symbols, while intuition sees them from the inside without assuming a specific point of view. And once again, the error in philosophy is often confusing them and trying to reach reality through the concepts of the analytical method. To conclude with Nishida, as we have seen in these pages, Nishida does not speak explicitly about expression of intuition in the philosophical language. Yet it looks to me that the images and the evocative language that he uses for expressing his idea are still an evident clue, I would say, about his position. So distance is needed for think about our object and know it better, but we cannot forget that such distance just comes second. So the personal encounter with the ordinary world is the most real thing for us. And in conclusion, Nishida, as we can see, is totally fine with using some images for expressing this foundation that cannot be analyzed. And this intention is perfectly exemplified in this last passage from Nishida's text. And he writes, no matter how firmly the certainties of natural science surround us from the outside with the steel chain of causality, we, turning inwards, possess the certainty of the even deeper and more immediate world of freedom, from which even the so-called world of natural science is nothing but a mediated and manufactured world. Hakuin, praising time, said that yesterday at dawn we swept away the soot of the old year. Tonight we kneaded rice cakes for the new year. There is a pine tree with its roots and a wild tangerine with its leaves. I put on a new dress and await the arrival of guests. It is exactly like this. The truly immediate world for us is the world of flowing time, the world of creative evolution. And we can go to the second part about Hersch and les images de l'œuvre de Monsieur Bergson. And here, Hersch in this book starts speaking about Bergson when she is still a university student of literature, so before meeting Karl Jaspers and before approaching philosophy. And in this book, she analyzes the use of images in some of Bergson's most famous books as a proof, she says, of his original movement of thought. And she defines movement of thought, as we can see in the slide, the form given to ideas, and therein lies the meaning of philosophy. Meaning thus lies in the subjective and personal part of philosophy, that of the philosopher's act, which makes each philosophy individual. And well, to me, these words are quite effective because they recall the words that Nishida uses for describing proof. They are more or less the same. But regarding Hersch's answer to Kant's third antinomy, in this book, in Les images de l'œuvre de Monsieur Bergson, the idea that the world can be approached in two different ways is already implicit, of course. Nevertheless, it is just after meeting Jaspers that Hersch can elaborate the idea that there are two different modes, she says, two different modes of staying in the same one world. And especially in L'Illusion philosophique, she writes that when we try to orient scientifically, we follow some necessary and logical paths. While when we try to overcome the limits of such perspective, we use instead our freedom to glimpse some ciphers, this is a word from Jaspers, some ciphers of the transcendent value that is precluded to our intellect, thus starting to exist. So also in Hersch's case, it is totally feasible that necessity and freedom collaborate and coexist in the same one world, depending on the perspective or the goals we opt for. And okay, coming back to Hersch's analysis of Bergson, in the introduction of this book immediately states that an objective comprehension is not enough when we approach a philosophical system. So images are needed for letting the timbre of the other resonate within us. And in this sense, she affirms in the end of the slide, I therefore call image any figure of style that aims to give the idea a more sensible form. And I think that this definition from Hersch could be a good definition of what I'm meaning with image in this presentation. By the way, here are Hersch words regarding the relationship between concept and image through Bergson. And yeah, this is not an image, but is still effective, so I read it. The image will only be the points of reference, the symptom of a fundamental intuition developed in a philosophical world. By Bergson's own admission, the representation of a philosophy through an image is neither superficial nor far removed from its living source. We have only two instruments of expression, the concept and the image. The system develops in concepts, but it is in images that it condenses when we push it back towards the intuition from which it derives. Here, I think that two aspects are relevant. First, of course, the reference to intuition. Then second, the dominant attitude in this part, which Hersch defines as pure receptivity of abandonment and silence. And this is really a philosophy of concrete and lived experience, because no form is at work here and everything flows smoothly. And the first image from Hersch describes intuition exactly in this way. He writes, the whole external world suddenly comes to life. Bergson feels currents touching him. Matter thus dissolves into innumerable threads, running in all directions like shivers. We no longer have an idea that is expressed as clearly as possible. It is an experienced impression, a way of making concrete the universe around him as it appears to him, almost a feeling that the universe conveys to him. So as we have read, the image we find here at the beginning of the slide is a translation device from the abstract to the concrete. But this leads to a problem to Hersch, because such translation turns out to be nearly impossible. And she says, in this field of action, words kill, and we must express life with words of death. So to Hersch, the solution here is to give up expressing intuition through language directly, and rather use language as an appeal. And in this sense, images should become a means to educate the reader to an attentive attitude, says Hersch. So here Hersch says that certainly images are closer to reality than are algebraic signs. And well, I think that this really recalls again Nishida and the quotation about Hakuin, no? By the way, images work as a clue that something meaningful cannot be explained analytically. And in this regard, we have this second relevant quotation. Hersch writes, images are also arguments in another way. The understanding that Bergson obtains through them is not a logical understanding. In logic, one understands the thinker's reasoning well. One can find fault with it and oppose the right reasoning. Bergson takes us down another path. The difficulty he encounters is to make people conceive what he wants. Only later can the experience be examined and judged. For now, it is an experience. And if there is one thing that cannot be doubted, it is precisely what we have experienced firsthand. At this point, Hersch's discourse changes somehow tone and takes an unexpected direction which distances itself from Nishida, I would say, because the object is there, the subject is immersed in such real experience, yet such immersion is not intended to give total satisfaction to the subject. And Hersch writes, whoever, fixing their gaze on an object of the external world, has had the impression that things resist the gaze like a prey that, while pretending to be there, in reality dissimulates, we understand what the veil of which Bergson speaks is. The object is there, it is real, it is more real than it seems. I cannot see in its life, I only see a symbol. I do not see the thing itself. I confess I do not penetrate it. I only read the label that is stuck on it. So this is something totally absent in Nishida. And we can see that the moment of active receptivity is followed by a violent activity, because Hersch writes, born out of the living, rich, shifting depths, here is a precise weapon, a sharp weapon eager to engrave the real. This evokes an inner movement contrary to that evoked by the melody. Instead of assuming the receptive attitude of the listener, one contracts, one gathers to attack, aiming at a single end, which absorbs us completely. These are the two poles of Bergsonism, the attitude of the one who listens and the attitude of the one who acts, the attitude of the one who rejoices in art and the one who struggles. There is an activity that synthesizes the two, artistic creation. So here we should point out that only now, according to Hersch, artistic activity can be understood because the artist is naturally predisposed to the activity of intuition, of course, but he is also animated by the violent desire to give an effective form to his experience. Then we should also notice some relevant implication regarding images, because the need for precision that animates Berson's artistic spirit leads him to try in every way to express his experience as clearly as possible. And so something interesting happens because trying to awaken the reader's attention is not enough, and it is necessary to recover the scientific vocation to precision and effectiveness. So the method of science comes back. And at the end of Hersch analysis, we can read that thinking by images means using clear, definite, and concrete images, but preserving the movement of the image. And I think that these last two images from Les Images de l'œuvre de Monsieur Bergson let us understand well what Hersch means. She says, the image in Bergson is true concrete image, spontaneously arising and not intellectually right, artificially associated with the fundamental idea. He makes us feel in this style endowed with scientific clarity, the intuitive impulse. It still has the warmth of the soul, of the primary conception born of the whole being, intelligence, vision, sensibility. She goes on saying, this life has been a long effort to cover the fiery mass of boiling metals with a cold, solid film. But there are volcanic eruptions, and if the earth were a living being, as mythology intended, it would perhaps, during its rest, dream of those abrupt explosions in which it suddenly comes into contact with what is deepest in it. In many ways, moreover, Bergson is close to that primitive imagination that is at the origin of mythology. So before trying to draw some conclusion, I think that we should really briefly say something about defense de la technicité and philosophie, because here some questions remains unanswered. And in particular, we have spoken of the artist's gaze, but what about the philosopher's gaze? So in Defense de la technicité and philosophie, Hersch confirms that philosophy must be engaged with reality, of course, yet it must be engaged with clarity as well, as we have just seen in the last quotations. So in this regard, Hersch speaks of technicity of philosophy, and she says, we can read, what will this technical keyboard of philosophy be, playing for it the same role as sounds for music or colors for painting? Without a doubt, abstraction. So what distinguishes the philosopher from the artist to Hersch is the expression of intuition in a system of ideas, she says. So according to her, the philosophical experience is an artistic experience founded in the ground of thought. She says a spiritual experience of thought. And here we can read this passage from Defense de la technicité and philosophie. She writes, we must therefore understand that in philosophy, thought is not a means. Thought is the philosophical reality itself, which in no way prevents philosophical reflection from seeing it as incomplete, needing lived extensions, applications, or experiences in order to find an ontological reality. Philosophical thought is philosophical experience itself. So to conclude about Hersch, in this context, images appear to constitute the instrument of direct grasp. No, she said the cold and solid film in the previous quotation. And it is this film that provides the optimal temperature, I would say, for the philosophical experience. So to Hersch, Berson's style precisely described this, and I think that again, as in the case of Nishida, the words used by Hersch are the best demonstrations of how, even in her expression, this warmth is perceptible, or at least, I hope that I showed it. But trying to draw some conclusion, because I'm running out of time, the first aspect that I would like to emphasize is the attitude with which the two thinkers approach the issues analyzed. So in Nishida, it is possible to retrace a sympathy which let us perceive the primordial flux of life and places us within our object. We have already well seen this. And thanks to intuition, we can grasp our object completely from the inside. Instead, in the case of Hersch, we can find what de Monticelli defines a desire for restitution, which is made up of the wonder and gratitude for the richness of the world, but also of the desire to communicate such richness in some way, Hersch says, to give it a subjective form. And this common deep perception from within introduces the matter of attention, which brings us back to Kant's problem. So in Nishida, our intelligence constructs some concepts that are pragmatically effective, as he says, but our mistake emerges when we want to impose this manner of conceptualizing things on our inner life, to which, yes, they are totally inappropriate. So here intuition emerges as additional focus on intelligence and its pragmatic functioning. And Giladi perfectly explained this when he says, we can read, that in Nishida, seeing is carefulness and attention to what is in the world. And I want to emphasize that also in Hersch, education in the act of seeing plays an essential role. And Mucinelli stated clearly, she says that in Hersch, seeing is to let us be guided by things without imprisoning them and being stimulated by both feeling and reason. So the intuitive side can grasp something deeper. And the second aspect is the common position of Nishida and Hersch regarding the intellectual approach that produces logical concepts. So we have just seen that in Nishida, the scientific approach is necessary, yet it cannot claim to say something anything about the deeper truth. As in Bergson, metaphysics uses intuition, so metaphysics is not a conceptual discipline. And this sounds like quite a fundamental conclusion, I would say. But we can see that also in Defense de la technicité and philosophie, so also in Hersch, abstraction and the scientific method, of course, are necessary means, yet something more is needed to grasp the foundation. And in Illusion philosophique, Hersch will call this metaphysical truth. So once again, metaphysics is something dealing with an intuition beyond logic. And this common position has, of course, some implications regarding philosophical expression, which should be the main aim of this speech. So in the quotations that we have read, it appears that although in two different styles, of course, the pages of both authors maintain what we have defined, the warmth of experience. So these explosions of everyday images immediately make sensible the concepts that give explanation on the one side, while on the other side, just as immediately, concept intervenes to condense the vital fire of the images and to contextualize them and provide clarity. And I also think that the ethical attitude that we mentioned at the beginning with Nishida lies in the respect with which we enhance an experience that cannot be tamed by the intellect while we keep pursuing a scientific clarity. And here, images are the means to make people conceive what the authors want and to predispose the reader to their own intuitive and attentive experience. And this is what philosophical expressions should pursue, according to Nishida and Hersch, and probably also philosophy itself. Very final point, the third aspect, is the distance between the conclusions that Nishida and Hersch arrive at. Because, I tried to sum up the common points, but we also have to keep the distance. So I will briefly recap the 4 points, the 4 differences. First, for Hersch, matter remains something other, and then the subject forms this other thing. This generates a violent activity that would be impossible to imagine in Nishida. This is the first point. The second, to Hersch, the experience of the encounter, it's something that comes after the scientific approach to the world. Instead, to Nishida, it is our very first experience. Third, the abstraction that Hersch identifies as technicality of philosophy finds no counterparts in Nishida. And fourth, as Dalisier notices, as we can read in his image of the two mirrors, in Nishida, intuition is both our effort and the world's effort. So there are two mirrors, and the two parties involved are one the mirror for the other. So there is this dual process of self-consciousness. And this is absent in Hersch. Nevertheless, I would conclude that despite this distance, there is still a common ground in Nishida and Hersch, namely the awareness that the world can be approached in different ways which are complementary, we have seen, but not interchangeable. And the most fundamental experience of reality is something that has a meaning, and dispassionate knowledge comes just second. So philosophy must start from this encounter, and it must try to express this encounter between concepts and images. So to me, this awareness that unites Hersch and Nishida, despite their constitutive difference, exactly this awareness is the reason why such approach, which is common to them, should be taken into utmost consideration, because we often complain that Western and Eastern perspective appear difficult to juxtapose. So when we find some common factors, probably, this is something meaningful. So coming back to the title of my speech, I think here we have really found one of such common experiences. So from West to East, two ways and one word. And that's all. Thanks for your attention.
Someone has some question or consideration, please.
Thank you. I have a general question about the idea of intuition. How can you be sure that your own intuition is an effective intuition of the world? When I think of intuition, I think of something that I feel, but I can be wrong about my thinking. So every philosophy which starts from intuition has the problem of how can we ground the sensation of the unicity of the world on such an unstable foundation. Because my intuition is different from your intuition. And how can you dare to transform your intuition in the grounding of the it's a question similar to the question posed by Enrico. European philosophical tradition, Cartesian philosophical tradition starts from a question about intuition. In the Meditazioni metafisiche, in Meditation Metaphysique, Descartes says that the key point is that I cannot be sure about my own intuition. So for these problems arises, for example, in phenomenological tradition. And for this reason, Hersch wants to start from the intuition is not the first position, but the second position. I need a sort of social intuition, so a linguistic social intuition. Otherwise, the idea of a personal grounding, it seems to me not enough stable.
Okay. So I think there are two different answers for these authors because they reach a common conclusion. So the common conclusion is that they are aware of this problem, especially Ash, I would say, but it's not the most relevant thing for them. So it's just about point of view. This is the common conclusion. They arrive at this from two different ways. So to Nishida, I had to cut this, but it will be in my article. What is interesting to me is that I was searching again the slide, I cannot find it, but I go by memory. You have, when he speaks of two different modes of approaching the world, he says the way of thinking, which I think it's quite clear, but the most interesting is the one about pure experience, because he says pure experience is this encounter, as I was saying, between what we would call the subject and the object. In Inquiry into the Good, he calls them the world and the individual. So it is this encounter. The interesting thing is that you never have the Kantian object in itself, because thinking is the subject thinking. Pure experience is subject plus object, but you never have a pure object. So to him, it's just not a problem. And he has no problem in saying he's aware that intuition is different for everyone. Indeed, he says that we cannot be sure about the object in itself. Since we cannot be sure about the object in itself, we can say that Heinz gaze to the star is the most real thing for us. He doesn't say it's the most real thing in general for us, because no one can prove that stars are like scientists can define. The experience we have is the star as this golden text in the azure. And this is what we are sure of. No one can provide what the scientists say. In the case of Hersch, when she was 6 years old, she was speaking with her father. This she says in her interview she gave with 2 students from her. This was her, she says that this was her first philosophical experience. She was asking his father, who was a mathematician, so quite a different mind from her. How can I say that they had a stove at their home? How can I say that the stove is real? And his father said to her, okay, try to put your hand in the stove, then tell me if it's real. I mean, you will get burned if you put your hand. Of course, she didn't put the hand in the stove. And she says, of this period, I remember the sense of impotence, because I cannot doubt that the thing is there. I know that there is the fire in the stove. But this says nothing about the thing in itself, Kant would say, no? 20 years after this, a bit more, she meets Jaspers, and she discovers that it is exactly because I cannot know the thing in itself that I can use my freedom. Because, you know, if I know the thing in itself, I am somehow obliged to agree with this truth. But since I cannot know the truth, I am free to draw my path. And this now that at this point that Hersch finds intuition, because I first tried, this is from Jaspers, of course, I first tried the scientific knowledge of the world. I know that it is not enough. I discovered that it is not enough. Then I try to draw my free paths, my intuition. And so again, my personal truth become the thing I am most sure. It's not objective truth, but it's real for me.
Not really a question, but
Yes.
just an observation. And I just wanted to cite matter and memory of Bergson and the concept of image in the book, because the point is the ontology and the idea that images is not things in itself, but not the representation of idealistic thought. And so the world is made of images. It's the way in which the common sense talks about things, something that is not independent from the perception, but not totally isolated from the subjective perception. And I cite that because in the maybe second chapter, Bergson talks about the attentive recognition in opposition to the, I don't know, mechanic, automatic recognition. And so I was curious about your the point where you stressed the question of attention in Hersch, maybe.
But it's also in Nishida.
Oh, in Nishida, okay. So
no, it's
to say too explicit.
Yeah, no, this is curious to me because when I arrived here, I knew about attention in contemporary women philosophers. It's quite common, and the article I was quoting from Buccinelli, it's an article in which she compares Hersch with Bale. But I would say that this attention is common to every famous women contemporary philosopher. Yeah, you got it. And Tarantino, in her book Chiaroscuri della Ragione, she says that not only Hersch and Dale, but also Zambrano, Stein and Arendt, so names all the most famous women philosophers of our time. They all come from Kant, she says, and I agree with her. And she says that they have a pietas towards the real. And this expression comes from Zambrano, but it's perfect for all of them. In the particular case of Hersch, what is interesting to me is her definition of form. So form to Hersch, I quote it at a certain point, giving form. This is in Lettre la Forme, it's 1946. So her third book, if you consider a book, the thesis about her son. And she says form is our hold on the matter. So subjective hold takes the matter. What comes out is the form, which is an in-between of matter and subject. So as you were saying, it's not something separated, not only object or not only subject, or as Professor Isaac was saying before, there are two unhuman extremes, I would say, the perfect form and the perfect matter. But the human experience is a spectrum in the middle. Hersch says we are on a crest, I would say, between pure form and pure matter, and we develop our existence just in this crest in the middle.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Lorenzo.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very short thing. Maybe it's the sort of linguistic observation that Enrico Fonger was doing before. I mean, because when we deal with intuition, like in European languages, comes with a preposition, which would suppose also like, okay, I can locate myself and so on, but like then it's either I'm looking inside the thing in itself, or I'm looking inside myself. So it seems to be a side that kind of penetrates within something. And in Japanese, we just have chokan. So it's like the stress is not on the where, but so it's not a locative. It's not a locative situation, but rather like a focus on the how. So it's a stylistic kind of, so like it's direct. Chokan is like just like something that goes straight to. So like in a sense, like the poetic gaze would be a kind of intuition because it's not mediated by any kind of abstraction or like a toolbox of concepts. And so yeah, I mean, like you got it perfectly. It's like there's no issue at all with your exposition of that. But the fact that of course, Nishida was translating from European sources, but using a Japanese word that actually has quite a strong and different connotation, and it would even make more sense maybe to just use chokan as you're discussing it, because it's like really not something like a European intuition, I would say.
If I can add a word, so Nishida doesn't use only the word chokan, that means directly seen, but also the word chokaku, that is very difficult to translate into Italian because we have only one word. And kaku is a very difficult word because on the one side could have a Buddhist meaning as a satori. On the other side is related to kankaku, to sensation. But a sensation that give a knowledge somehow, not pure passive. And Nishida uses both, referring, for example, to intuitional things. And his Berzon, as you pointed with your quotation, is very Zen oriented because he says that Berzon and Akwin about time says the same thing. So there is this kind of feeling of Nishida that he said he feel the biggest sympathy for Berzon, particularly in his first period, because he's very related to his Zen experience. And then the intuition that Nishida is talking about, of course, could be also the individual intuition, but in this case is the smallest intuition. Nishida, in an inquiry into the good, intuition can have several degrees, and the basic intuition is, to use your word, the intuition of a subjectless subject. This intuition merge with the opening of the world, of the reality as it is. It is not individual, at least for the first Nishida, and therefore it cannot.
So it's an intuition that arrives after.
It's at the same time before and after. And in the meaning, there is language, and language cut the intuition and introduce reflection. Therefore, thanks to language, the original, the first impression that a baby, a newborn baby has of the world is cut of when when he started to speak one language. But then you can, through some practices, one of them is the artistic one, you can go somehow back to this kind of experience. You can hear the sound of the sea, as you said, or the wind. And then you will speak about it, so cut the experience, and this kind of developing can is during your entire life. Therefore, for example, is the quotation of Hakuin is very interesting because this passage is in a book of Hakuin where Hakuin is commenting one sutra. So this is the comment of the ideogram toki, that means time. So it's actually the Hakuin's definition of time. And this time is very interesting because it started said yesterday, we did something for tomorrow. So it's not past and future, but yesterday in our personal experience, and tomorrow we prepare something to eat. And then you switch and say there is a pine tree, there is a tangerine, something related to the trees, you said. But at the end he said, I put away a new clothes, so I change my clothes because in the present I change, and I'm waiting for the guest. Yeah. And the situation is the first day of the year in a Buddhist temple. Hakuin is the abbot of the temple, so you have to prepare for the new day of the year, and he's waiting for the guests who really comes to visit the temple. But actually, there is a double meaning because Hakuin is trying to say what time is. And time is not only the presence of the animal, but at the same time is the past, yesterday is tomorrow, and is the waiting for a guest. Who is this guest? This is the problem. And therefore, there is, I think, as far as I understand Nishida or Dogen, for example, there is always this kind of duality, animality, of course, but at the same time, the human beings are Homo sapiens, as you said, we speak, so we cut this experience, but nevertheless, through some practices, we can go back to this kind of experience sometimes and broaden our understanding. And then we can take the other inside of this experience, the I, you, and the society and the other people, and then not only the present, but also the past and the future. And this kind of going back and forth of this kind of experience is probably what Nishida tries to say in An Inquiry into the Good, as far as I understand. At the same time, it is only the first Nishida, the first book, then he changed several times.
But forgetting the
sorry, I don't know if you...
It's useful because he changes his idea, he develops the concept, so they are also finer than at the beginning. But I think that the attitude of Nishida is already clear
Yes, I think so.
So I wanted to point out two brief things before I start with yours because it's shorter. When you were speaking about Nishida appreciating Bergson, it is interesting to me that Nishida and Hersch moved the same critique to Bergson, even having different background. No? So they both say that, okay, Bergson has this good approach, but he doesn't really leave what he says because in Bergson, it is still an intellectual experience. And I don't have the passages here. Maybe I quote them in the article, I don't know, but they nearly use the same words, both Hersch and Nishida, even without knowing each other, of course. So they had the same impression. And another interesting thing, probably Bergson didn't comment directly Nishida, but he read Hersch's thesis and he appreciated it. He said to her, you should work as a psychologist because you perfectly understood everything about me. And she was 20 years old when she wrote it. So this was about this. Regarding your comment instead, and the idea that intuition very often in Western philosophy is about the positions or intuition of who is perceiving what, and in the Japanese case, it's not the same. I would say that Hersch and women philosophers are an in-between because also to them, space is not important. So the position from which we are perceiving, and they totally agree that intuition happens in this sort of fullness, I would say. So it doesn't even make sense speaking of subject, because in this experience, you are not perceiving as a subject. It's not important. It's not relevant. The difference instead is that, for Nishida, it has a great relevance, and it's maybe the highest moment, or at least the one in which we can perceive the truth, or at least the truth that is available to us. Instead, in women philosophers, it's the beginning of perception. So it's like the first step that you move for reaching your truth, but it's just the beginning, not the most important aspect. But yeah, this thing about the role of space, it's, I would say, common.
Hey, Jim, please. One other point related to what Daniela said. I think the Matter and Memory is the favorite book of Nishida, and also Pensée Mouvant, of course. And the concept of image is, I think, could be appropriate to try to understand what Nishida is. Because as Deleuze says at the beginning of image movement, Nishida has the same problem of Bergson, so of the psychology of the end of the 19th century. So the image is inside and movement is outside. And so how to find a philosophical position in order to make this kind of dualism or inner and exteriors. And the concept of image of Bergson is in Matter and Memories is one attempt to overcome the problem. The other is Husserl with his phenomenology. But Nishida, therefore, I think Nishida finds soon this affinity with Bergson, because it's also the problem of Nishida, of course.
And the attentive recognition, Matter and Memory, is the moment when the thought, the subject, could go from actual plan to the virtual, the memory, to the spirit, to the thought. And there is one point, as Deleuze said, where there is a zone of area, zone, I don't know the English translation, of indiscernibility between past and present. So this idea of time about which you were talking about is very consistent with that.
Hersch has something really similar. She calls it petite durée, or miniature d'éternité, so a miniature of eternity. But yeah, maybe this will be the topic of the next speech. So you will listen this in the last part of the maybe.
At the same time, to go back to Piergiacomo, then Nishida had also at the time the problem of New Kantian. So started with Kant.
Yeah.
And so on that one side, he appreciated very much New Kantian because, to say with Hersch, they are very logical and clear, methodic. But the truth stayed on the side of Bergson. For Nishida,
he says the same. No, he says we have to keep both something from Bergson and something from the Neo-Kantian. So probably from the Neo-Kantian, this rigor, but from Bergson, this lived experience is how I read sort of experience.
Sorry.
I have a question about the conclusions you brought up at the end. In the first one, rather surprised me, where you said that Hersch, metaphysics uses intuition, so it is not conceptual description.
Yeah, it should be involved in that.
I mean, if you take intuition in the Catholic sense of apperception before the eye is established and before reflection, or if you take it in a more general sense of kind of flash, a suspicion of meaning, which is then reflected. Whichever way you take it, metaphysics needs some conceptual description. For example, the image that you talked about as being very rich and meaningful and so, that has gone through reflection and come out the other end is a different image from the first image. It's like a naivete, a second naivete. It's a different kind of image. And it is precisely because it went through a conceptual description. So how is it possible, first of all, to have a metaphysics without a conceptual description? And how is it even possible to do anything with metaphysics without, with intuition, without thinking about it? Now, actually, there's a bigger question behind it, and that is that you talked about a second level, a philosophy at a second level. In other words, what philosophy does, or how thinking takes place, or how the mind works. But the actual metaphysics, the actual worldview that Hersch comes up with as a result of this method, and how that differs from Nishida, that's a completely separate question. You're just talking at the second level here, so I understand it. But even so, how can you say that metaphysics has intuition and therefore it is not conceptual description? Can you get the beat?
Yeah, this needs either 2 or 3 speeches maybe for explaining it at least in half, because I'm more acquainted with the way she reaches this. Again, I think it's just a provocation from both Jaspers and Hersch, because she writes this in Illusion Philosophique. So Illusion Philosophique is her reaction to Jaspers. So basically the Hersch from Les Images de Monsieur Bergson and the Hersch from Illusion Philosophique is exactly the same idea. There is just 5 years between these 2 books. The only difference is that there is Jaspers in the middle between these 2 books. So what she gets, thanks to Jaspers, is that metaphysics is not something about the truth with the capital T. So basically what I was saying in the answer before, her point is saying, okay, it is impossible to state what the truth with the capital T is. And basically, illusion philosophique, the philosophical illusion, is exactly about this. When the philosopher thinks to say something about the truth, actually, he's just saying about something about his truth and his path for reaching the truth, but he says nothing about the truth. The illusion is this, and the philosopher would never start philosophizing if he considers his illusion, because if he says, okay, I cannot reach the truth, so there's no point in reasoning, I don't even start my path. But it's not like this. This truth that the philosopher thinks to glimpse is so important to him that he still does his path. But this is why the intuition is the basis of metaphysics, because metaphysics is the reflection on the truth, not on the being with the capital B again. But they cannot reach it. So metaphysics is based on intuition, means exactly this. Means that everything starts with me glimpsing something of the transcendent value, not with me knowing something. Then, of course, you have to reason, use conception. I mean, also to Hersch is important to make clarity, to reason rigorously about things and make distinction where possible. But she's also Jaspersian, so it's important also to state our limits. And our limit is that we cannot glimpse the truth with capital T. So saying that metaphysics comes from intuition means, look, you cannot know the real truth. So you always start from your intuition, and then you use your reason for reflecting on it and systematizing it. So it's a provocation against who still thinks in the 21st century that we can reach the so-called truth. But of course, reasoning is still essential also to her.
Thank you very much, Jacopo.